Okay, it's 12:05. We'll go ahead and get started. We'll let all the latecomers show up as they please. Thank you all for coming to the very first ever virtual Partners of Scott County Watersheds Educational Forum. My name is Cassie Drool, and I am the coordinator of the organization. And before we get started with our speaker, I wanted to share a little bit about who partners are, and then we'll get right to the presentation. You all should be muted right now, and we would ask that you stay muted until the end of the presentation. We will be able to take questions through the chat, and then if you can't do chat, we might be able to do the audio questions as well, but we ask that you hold all the questions until the end of the presentation. So I will go ahead and start. So the mission of Partners of Scott County Watersheds is to improve the stewardship of Scott County watersheds through education, technical guidance, and volunteer opportunities. We do this in a few different ways. First of all, we are funded by several municipalities in Scott County, as well as different organizations and private memberships. So they're the ones that keep us going. We are able to fund these educational forums through that money. We have these once a month. Normally they're at the Davenport Public Libraries, at the Eastern Avenue Library and the Fairmount Libraries. So in the future, you will see more information about those monthly forums. They're held on the third Tuesday of the month. We also do snapshot water quality monitoring events for volunteers. Those happen 3 times a year. And we train volunteers on how to test for different water quality parameters that will measure how healthy a watershed is. And it's very easy to do. It's a lot of stuff that you may or may have done at your high school chemistry class, like what's the pH, what is the temperature, also getting a little more advanced as to what kind of nitrogen or phosphorus concentrations are found in a watershed. It's a really great volunteer opportunity, and we will share more of that information in the coming months as well. We do have an email listserv that you can sign up through our website, www.partnersofscottcountywatersheds.org, if you'd like to know more about our latest activities. You can also follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. Oops. So here's an example of some students who were doing some water quality sampling. We're always raising money to help pay for the costs of this water quality sampling, because we have to send some of our parameters to a lab for testing. So if you're interested in contributing to that, you can donate through our website, or we also have a GoFundMe campaign. We also have membership and partnership programs. You can see there are different levels for memberships and corporate and organization partners. So you can go to our website to learn more about those. The next forum will be Tuesday, May 19th. Hopefully it will be back at the libraries, 12 to 1 at the Eastern Avenue Library and 5 to 6 at the Fairmount Library. We are unfortunately canceling our spring snapshot due to the virus concerns, but stay tuned and we will have more opportunities for volunteers on Saturday, July 18th and Tuesday, October 6th. And with that, I will give it to Keith.
Okay. Cassie, can you hear me? Let's double check that.
Yes.
Okay. Well, when Cassie asked that, whoopsie, let's get back to the first one. Asked that I would be available to do this. She asked about the oxbow restoration research that we're doing, and I first said yes, and then I was looking through my material and I thought, well, shoot, I could incorporate this in a more comprehensive way, including more of a focus on the oxbows. But at this point, I thought we could kind of look in the landscape to find out where we see opportunities for improving water quality. So this is a version of a talk I've given in a couple places, maybe at the organic meeting and maybe the Iowa Academy of Science or something like that. So there's some places in here where you may have seen some things before. Otherwise, I just wanted to stretch together a bigger concept as far as this presentation. And like many of mine, I tend to have too many slides, so we're going to blast through them just to kind of keep everybody engaged. So a guiding principle that I like to operate on is, it's really simple, is letting wet spots be wet on the landscape. And this presentation is going to focus on where do we find wet spots in the landscape, and how can we view these and encourage their activity as to serve as a natural bioreactor. These lands have evolved over time to be wet, and that should really be our first priority for developing kind of a green infrastructure, which is to let them be wet again. We published this paper in 2013, and I still feel like it maybe hasn't gotten its due, because I think there's a lot to like here. So what conditions are needed to be a natural bioreactor? I think most of us are familiar with the constructed bioreactors that take wood chips or dig a pit for tile drainage to flow through, get in contact with organic matter content in the wood chips, and reduce the nitrate to nitrogen gas. Well, denitrification is this process by which nitrate is converted into gas by heterotrophic bacteria. And what conditions are required? Typically, an organic carbon source, anaerobic conditions, or at least low oxygen conditions, and a nitrogen supply. So it's kind of a straightforward process. Where do we find these optimal conditions on a hydrologic flow path? Well, in eastern Iowa, this might be a typical view of what the watershed landscape looks like. We have grass waterways draining kind of a dissected glacial till landscape. That just means that it's evolved over time with drainages and slopes, as opposed to the Des Moines lobe, which is more recently glaciated and has not evolved to the level of like eastern Iowa. So we see grass waterways, we see conveyance in roadside ditches, both of which kind of feed water and nutrients to floodplains that include things like oxbows, okay? So what we're gonna do is kind of follow the water downstream from waterways to ditches to oxbows to floodplains, and just take a look at all the nutrient processing capacity that's located in these locations. We see grass waterways in the landscape everywhere. Okay, these are typically low areas in the swales or the low spots in the landscape that are kind of been converted to grass for better conveyance of water and to reduce the sediment export. Well, if you dig into the subsurface of these waterways, what you find oftentimes is a lot of essentially eroded topsoil deposited in these waterways, just loaded full of organic carbon and kind of a organic silt that's in these waterways. This is a cross section from a location that I've worked with in South Central Iowa, Walnut Creek and Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge. But you can kind of tell that there's a different deposit here of organic material compared to the loess and the till on either side of that watershed or that drainage. If you dig into the water table levels in there, you can see that they remain saturated all year round. The open circles in that diagram are the average depth of the groundwater surface, both in this first order catchment, and the bottom one says usually the water table stays relatively flat and high all year round, as opposed to the upland that surrounds it, where the water table might fluctuate, 5 meters in a given year. So we have organic matter present in these waterways. We have a high water table indicating saturated conditions and so forth. If you look at the dissolved oxygen characteristics in the upland catchment, the DO, dissolved oxygen in the uplands, say 6 to 8 milligrams per liter. It's essentially almost gone in the waterway. Okay, so it's a low oxygen environment. And therefore, you look at the subsurface nitrate concentrations in that groundwater. The upland ag fields have 10 to 15 milligrams per liter of nitrate, and the waterway is essentially 0. So that would be a fine location to see a natural bioreactor on the landscape, is in these grass waterways. Following the water downstream a little bit, what about roadside ditches? We're all familiar with driving across Iowa's country roads. Every road mile in Iowa has a ditch on both sides to drain the water off the roadway. And we were curious whether these areas provide water quality benefits. We had a project that was funded by the Iowa Nutrient Research Center where we looked at the water quality benefits of roadside ditches. According to Iowa DOT, design specifications are normally along their roadways 10 feet wide and about 5 feet deep. And our area was not necessarily on all, focus was not on all roadside ditches everywhere. What we were curious about was roadside ditches that receive water flow and nutrients from small catchments. So we weren't concerned about the watershed area draining underneath a bridge or a culvert on a roadway. We were interested in catchment areas, typically agricultural fields, that drain directly to a ditch. And then the ditch is the conveyance mechanism for flow and nutrients to the stream. Okay, so it's a very specific case, but you'll be surprised how common these areas are on the landscape. Our focus area was Lime Creek watershed in kind of east central Iowa in Buchanan County near Independence, 41 square mile watershed. Land cover, like most of eastern Iowa in many areas, about 80% row crop. So we were interested in trying to sample, install wells and so forth on these areas that receive flow and nutrients from upland catchments. And so through our floodplain mapping program, they've developed some high resolution LiDAR processing and developed flow accumulation grids that we could use to identify flow paths that take water into a roadside ditch. And in this example, there's a small catchment that drains water to the ditch, and then the ditch conveys that water to the stream. We monitored 6 different sites in Lime Creek watershed, probably where half of them were on gravel roads and half of them were on paved roads. This hatchet area on the left in Lime Creek shows all the areas that drain to a roadside ditch before they get to a stream. And you might think, oh, there might be a few more there than you might suspect. Well, it turns out that 30% of the watershed drains first into a roadside ditch before it gets to the stream. So what we're talking about here is not necessarily an isolated occurrence that rarely happens. You know, most of the areas in the headwater part of the watershed drains to a ditch, and then the ditch is the conveyance mechanism. We did a couple different investigations. I'm kind of abbreviating some of this. The soils investigation, we sampled for the particle size and some other nutrients and heavy metals and so forth. That's the subject for another day. I would say of the particle size, they tend to be a sandy loam. You know, they do receive sediment from the upland catchments. The water kind of preferentially takes some of the finer particles away, and you're left with with a more coarser grain material in the ditch that might be in the surrounding catchment. You can see the total nitrogen and carbon percentages and the carbon nitrogen ratio. So there's a fair bit of organic matter in these ditches. We did infiltration and bulk density measurements because we need those to look at the water capacity and the infiltration capacity. And we did these measurements at the different ditch sites. Okay, we're getting an average infiltration rate. Kind of hard to consider what those units are in millimeters per minute and so forth. But if you scale up a typical ditch that might be 500 feet long and 10 feet wide, and that infiltration rate 0.3 millimeters per minute. That ditch can conceivably infiltrate 54,000 gallons of water a day into these roadside ditches. So you add up all the ditch lengths and watersheds and 30% of a watershed draining into it, you're talking about a fair bit of water, okay? That water carries the nutrients, and that provides the way to get the nutrients delivered to the roadside ditch environment. We installed wells in these 6 different ditches. We had kind of 3 wells per ditch with where water first enters the ditch, a midpoint, and then water is kind of where it's exiting the ditch. Kind of see the range of conditions we were sampling in there. We looked at the water table fluctuations, the water levels. You see some interesting patterns. These are, again, the midpoint of 6 different ditches. You kind of see that the water table stays high for much of the year, and then, like across Iowa, we see a lot of drying out, less rainfall, a lot of ET, and the water tables drop and the ditches dry out in the summer. Okay, very typical pattern in all the ditches except this one in 5A, where this ditch was actually fed by tile drainage that discharged right into the ditch. And you can see that the water table level stayed relatively constant all year round, except when the tile dried, and all of a sudden the ditch water level dropped considerably. So what about the groundwater quality patterns? Well, 2 of the 6 sites had no detectable nitrate in the ditch groundwater at all. And 4 of the 6 sites did show evidence for groundwater nitrate reductions. Using this in the upper left here, we'll just look at this one, for example. The upland water, groundwater was at about 6 to 8 milligrams per liter. And by the time you get to the midpoint in the downstream well, most of that nitrate was gone. Likewise, we see for the other ones as well. So 4 of the 6 sites showed that concentration reduction. The average of those 4 sites showed a concentration reduction of about 60%, with inflow water of about 10 milligrams per liter and outflow water and groundwater at about 4 milligrams per liter. So what can we say about potential nutrient or nitrate processing capacity? Again, we had a 60% reduction. We had an infiltration rate that we measured. Now we're talking about surface water runoff flowing into the ditch and infiltrating into the subsurface and getting processed. Surface water runoff has about 1 to 2 milligrams per liter of nitrate in it, which you add all this together, and we see an approximate nitrate reduction rate of about 0.2 to 0.4 grams per square meter per day. Okay, it's kind of an odd unit, but that's the units that typically used on wetlands and other things that people are trying to measure nitrate reduction. Well, these retention rates are similar to what we've seen in our restored oxbows and also in wetlands. So these environments are actually doing an interesting job, a great job of processing some of the nitrate that's delivered to them. So can we consider roadside ditches to be linear wetlands? I think you can make a case for that. And I feel like there's opportunities in place to modify ditches to encourage more nutrient processing. Whether you look at maybe weir structures in these ditches to hold back that runoff water and encourage even more infiltration, or you think about a 2-stage roadside ditch. I gave this presentation to the Iowa DOT, and they were very interested in the 2-stage ditch design, and we are in the process of constructing and monitoring a brand new roadside ditch that will be constructed to be like a 2-stage ditch. If you want more information, there's a paper that we published in Science of the Total Environment talking about the subsurface nutrient processing capacity. Okay, so moving downstream, where else can we gain additional water quality treatment? Oxbow lakes. Oxbow lakes are these curve-shaped lakes that form in a meandering stream complex, and we'll see a video of one here in a second. Oxbow lakes are commonly found around the world. You can see as rivers meander across the landscape, they're constantly cutting off their old meanders and generating these kind of arc-shaped lakes. Here's an example from Malaysia, another river in Alaska. We see examples in Iowa and Midwestern prairie streams of oxbows. They're just a common occurrence in a natural meandering stream complex. How big are they? They can range from this Lake Chilkat in Arkansas. It's 10,000 acres, which is a cutoff of the Mississippi River, so you know it's big, or even small enough where you can essentially long jump over if you had to, okay? So they range, big, small, but they're found around the world. This little video is a great example of the evolution of a meandering stream. You kind of see as the stream is working its way around, eventually there's a cutoff and the Oxbow Lake is formed. We'll watch it again. It's a great little animation. We see evidence for this in many streams. For example, here's a stream that you can see over sequential air photos that the river starts to encroach on its meander loop and eventually cuts it off with that neck cut off, and then you're left with the Oxbow Lake behind. So that's a natural way of forming these things. In Iowa and throughout the Midwest, we kind of have accelerated the process through our stream straightening. Here's an example on the left of a stream what might have looked like in the 1930s. You can see the big meander bends of the stream. You come through and straighten it all. You essentially leave those meander loops high and dry and artificially created oxbows. Unfortunately, that's probably more the case in Iowa than the natural meandering system. There are folks at Iowa State and the Nature Conservancy and the Fish and Wildlife Service that are doing a lot of monitoring of oxbows as fish habitat. Here at the Iowa Geological Survey, we've been more focused on the water quality benefits of oxbow restorations. We're going to focus on a couple sites where we've been doing some monitoring. One is in the Des Moines Lobe near Webster City, and the other one is just outside of Cedar Rapids in Morgan Creek County Park. This is the construction history of the oxbow in Lyons Creek watershed in the Des Moines Lobe. See kind of a swale area that indicates this used to be a low area that may have had an oxbow in it, and you can really see it from LiDAR elevation. It was constructed, water fills in, and we are left behind with a nice little created oxbow lake. We did some monitoring out here over the last few years. It's called the Fry Oxbow site, named after the landowner. But we installed a series of wells in the yellow squares across the oxbow. This linear feature here is the created oxbow at a north and a south transect. We sampled in White Fox Creek and in the oxbow itself. And these arrows indicate the rough groundwater flow direction. So groundwater is flowing from the agricultural field into the oxbow. Honestly, well, I need to point out a couple of tiles that are draining into here from that agricultural field. Flow goes across the oxbow, kind of intersects with groundwater flow that's kind of flowing down the floodplain, across the oxbow or the meander bend, and we hit kind of a complicated flow system in the center of the floodplain. We did some surface geophysics and subsurface with electrical resistivity. Let's just focus in on the upper diagram. Just shows that the blue areas are more silty and fine textured, and the more warmer colors are more of the sands and stuff. So you can kind of see that we have some interesting geologic patterns there, and the sand area is also the area where we saw groundwater or flow from White Fox Creek kind of flow and bypass some of the surface channel in that meander bend through that coarse grain material. We monitored over a couple different years, actually 2 years in this one study. Then we came back and did some additional monitoring with a nitrate sensor. But the first 2 years, we sampled, there's local precipitation patterns. This is the tile discharge that was monitored by the Iowa Soybean Association into the oxbow itself. You kind of see a big pulses of tile drainage into the oxbow in 1 year, and more of a constant flow in 2015. And here's the groundwater levels in the up gradient well feeding the oxbow. Kind of see again a big groundwater recharge event going on there in July of 2014, a little more constant in 2015. So we measured the flows, we measured the concentrations, and estimated the loading into the oxbow. Here are the concentration patterns over those 2 years. Tile concentrations are overwhelmingly much higher. That's the main input of nitrate into this oxbow system, was the tile-fed nitrate as opposed to the groundwater levels. And you kind of see the tiles are definitely, 10, 20, 25 milligrams per liter. Down gradient groundwater had very little, if any, nitrate in it. If you compare the contribution from tiles to groundwater, they have a similar accumulated pattern across the year. But look at the order of magnitude in the kilograms of nitrogen input into the watershed, from 2 to 400 kilograms through the tiles and less than 0.2 kilograms for groundwater. So clearly the tile-fed oxbows are receiving a huge tile inload delivered to them. We looked at a couple different ways to estimate how much of that nitrate coming into the oxbow is retained. And over the 2 years, we looked at the average retention was essentially ranging pretty closely about 41 to 44%. Now, we can't say that all that is denitrification, because some of that nitrogen is uptake by algae and so forth, that really, you removed it from the water, but it's still in the organic form in the oxbow. So we've retained it, okay? We haven't really necessarily removed it all, although I think a huge part of that was removed through denitrification at the bottom of the oxbow's interface. Most of the oxbow retention occurred in the late summer and early fall. Typical is what we see across wetlands in Iowa, okay? So the average monthly retention during that late fall season, or late summer, early fall, was about, could be as much as 90%. On another site we looked at, we did some monitoring at the Morgan Creek County Park in outside of Cedar Rapids. A student at the University of Iowa, Bryce Haynes, had a master's project where he installed some wells at a newly constructed oxbow draining, I can't remember the size of this watershed, Morgan Creek, outside of Cedar Rapids. Bryce had his own drone, so he did do a series of drone pictures on the oxbow, and these set of 3 pictures are kind of taken on a life of their own in terms of before, during, and after construction. You kind of see in the June 2016, there's that meander scar that you see. The Fish and Wildlife Service came in and did some surveying, and this was the constructed oxbow they built in August 2016. And then by May 2017, you kind of see the standing water in the oxbow. So in this case, there are no tiles that feed the oxbow, but this oxbow is on a very active stream that receives flood inputs pretty regularly. This is the more recent flooding history in Morgan Creek from, say, 2011 to 2017. Kind of see how often that water surface elevation rises above the flood elevation, and it floods on a regular basis. So really, in this case, without having the tile inputs, the only way we're going to get nitrate into this system is through floodwater nitrate. And that's indeed what happened soon after it was built in 2017. There was a large flood in Morgan Creek that brought in a whole bunch of flood water, along with it, the nitrate concentrations in it. So we had a period of overbank flooding that occurred over the course of a day. We quantified how much of that water there was, and we can therefore estimate what the total amount of mass loading into that oxbow was. Bryce was able to run out and install a nitrate sensor in the oxbow soon after the flood wave passed, after about 5 days. Concentrations first measured were about 5.3 milligrams per liter, and they decreased to 0.7 over about a 3-week period. So it's also saying that some things are going on here in terms of the nitrate processing. Well, looking at the quantifying the amount of nitrate delivered to that oxbow during that one flood event, we estimated that over this 30-hour event, 165 kilograms of nitrate flowed past the oxbow, okay, just in the surface water alone. And the oxbow itself retained about 15 kilograms. So as a proportion of the total, it wasn't a lot, okay, in terms of you're not going to deliver a whole lot of nitrate just with the flood water alone. But we did see 15 kilograms of nitrate entering into the oxbow. Nearly all of that got processed during that 21-day period. If we can compare the two oxbow sites, the Fry Oxbow and the Des Moines Lobe and Morgan Creek Oxbow in eastern Iowa and the southern Iowa Drift Plain, you can see the watershed sizes are a little bit bigger in Morgan Creek. The stream nitrate was pretty similar. The size of the excavation to build the oxbows were kind of similar. There was slightly more groundwater seepage into Morgan Creek because it was sandier than it was up in the Fry Oxbow in terms of the inflow concentration. The nitrate delivery was primarily through tiles with Fry Oxbow and floodwaters through Morgan Creek. The mean nitrate concentration in the oxbow on a routine basis was about 4 to 6 milligrams per liter when it was constantly fed by tiles, as opposed to Morgan Creek that was about 0.5 milligram per liter because there's really no nitrate entering into it. The nitrate load into the oxbow with tile drainage was order of magnitude greater than Morgan Creek. So 200 to 400 kilograms versus 15 kilograms during one event. But the nitrate retention efficiency was 44 to 47% for Fry and 74% because it didn't get constantly replenished. We essentially just was taking that one-time load and then processed it all. And there's the rough cost of the oxbow. The Morgan Creek was about double the cost because the Lynn County Conservation wanted that dirt somewhere else, so they paid a lot more money to haul that out of the floodplain. As a big success of these projects related to oxbows, we petitioned and just recently was approved by the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, the science team, in the fall of 2019 to have a new practice added to the practice list, which we termed a multi-purpose oxbow. We called it a multi-purpose oxbow because of the dual benefits of fish and the nitrate reduction. Now we recognize that all oxbows will process nitrate when nitrate enters into them. But the only way these are really a conservation practice for water quality is when they see a lot of nitrate. And the only way they're going to see nitrate is if they're engineered to receive tile inputs. Okay, so these practices can be are approved to be put on the landscape, but they need to be engineered to receive the tile inputs, kind of like a constructed wetland. We did have several publications that formed the basis of this new practice, and you can kind of see the list there. Anybody interested, get a hold of me, and I can send you these papers. One of the things that was an offshoot of an earlier INRC project was working with Iowa State and some hydrologists here at the University of Iowa to develop a GIS methodology to identify these oxbows. We published a paper in this journal, Remote Sensing. And here, Courtney and Harvest, two students that were working on the project, looked at trying to use LIDAR to estimate where oxbows can be found and where restoration can occur. And they developed some criteria based on the geometry of the shapes, and could use that geometry combined with the digital elevation models to have the GIS program find oxbows that have some scar left in the landscape. And what we've seen from this sort of work, as we did it in the Boone River watershed, is that these oxbow sites are really everywhere. Now you could go ahead and just dig a hole in the ground in a river floodplain and essentially get some benefit. However, we feel like if you re-excavate some of these meander scars, there's some linkage back to the historical hydrology. And since they're depressions on the landscape, you have less material to excavate. But what you see is that they do have a lot of potential sites out there. Just in the Boone River watershed alone, in 4 different basins, these number of sites could exceed 150. Okay, so there are a lot of potential sites to look at restoring oxbows. During the excavation process, this would be typically what's needed. You dig a hole in the ground, typically down to where you might see sand and gravel that indicates the old stream bed elevation. You want to be really careful of the elevations. So you need to think about the engineering here. You don't want to have dig it too shallow and they dry out. Well, yeah, you could get some water quality benefits, but it's certainly a challenge for fish. So you want to have it deep enough that it's replenished by the local groundwater. You don't want to have the upstream end connected to the river or the stream, because then you get a lot of floodwater pulses and you get maybe excessive sedimentation. So you want to have the outlet to the stream be able to receive some of that backwater of a flood, but not the flood pulse as it's moving downstream. You kind of see the before, during, and after on this sort of picture as well, and they're just beautiful systems. Oxbow restorations in Iowa, they're typically 10 to 15,000 per half acre. And the excavation and the hauling of the dirt out of the floodplain is the most expensive aspect. There are more and more funding sources available for this practice. I think now that we have it listed as a practice, we're working on developing the guidance that goes along with it. But having this multi-purpose oxbow listed, I think, is a real win. So lastly, I want to just end with where water collects on the landscape in floodplains, okay? From our cartoon here, you can kind of see the Oxbow Lake. Now I'm talking about the entire floodplain in general, okay? These are humongous wet spots on the landscape, typically consisting of bar and swale topography and old meander scars. We've done a lot of work, myself and a colleague, Pete Jacobson at Grinnell College, on the Swamp White Oak floodplain site, which is a site owned by the Nature Conservancy on the shores or the floodplain of the Cedar River, okay? There's a USGS gauge right at the river itself, so it's a pretty handy location. And it's one of the few sites that has been relatively untouched by man. There's been some grazing and so forth, but overall it has a real natural appearance to it. And what you see when you take the LIDAR and kind of color code it for elevation, you see this typical bar and swale topography, ridge and swale. So the pinks here are the high elevation, the greens and the blues are low. And you kind of see as you move across the landscape how these floodplains are constructed as the river is eroding in some areas, depositing in other areas, and so forth. You took a cross section through that A prime bar and swale topography. This is what you see. You see the topography rising and falling and rising and falling and so forth. okay? As you go from a ridge to a swale, a ridge to a swale. We installed a series of wells in this floodplain to look at the groundwater quality and the geochemistry between a ridge and a swale environment. You see how closely connected they all are in the same hydrologic system, and yet we saw big water quality variations within this floodplain environment. In particular, you'd see that the depth of water is much higher, so it's like higher water tables in the swales, higher specific conductance, lower DO in the swales, lower oxidation reduction potential, and so forth. So we saw the same kind of geochemical patterns that we've seen in other locations here within the natural floodplain environment. And we kind of use these differences to identify where are the biogeochemical hotspots in a floodplain. Well, they typically occur in the fine textured organic rich swales. Boy, that sounds very familiar to the grass waterways, where we get fine textured organic rich waterways. We used some geophysics and so forth and mapped where denitrification was occurring in this floodplain. You kind of see from the pink areas here that it's not a constant everywhere. We see more denitrification potential occurring where we have these geochemical conditions, where we have these wet spots. What happens during a flood? Well, here's the same watershed or the same site, again, color-coded for elevation. And I've looked at the 2008 flooding and kind of see how floodwater fills that topography, fills the low areas first, and you kind of see just the higher areas composed predominantly of sand showing up later. And over time, you're just left with these little islands. Of course, in 2008, all the islands were underwater by about 10 feet. Well, we installed some continuously reading geochemical zones in the wells, and we actually monitored what the flood water or what the groundwater was doing in these environments during this 2008 flood. And there's a lot to digest here and not enough time to do that. But I want to show you a couple things. I just want to highlight a couple things is like, look at the dissolved oxygen patterns here, especially later on, where you'd see a pulse of dissolved oxygen enter into the swale and quickly be denitrified. You just see all this biogeochemical activity going on here. Here's this oxidation reduction potential. Okay, the sand environment in black didn't change much at all, but the conditions in that swale changed a lot. Every time there was an influx of surface water into the groundwater system, we saw a big burst of biogeochemical activity, and that quickly consumed the DO and changed the geochemistry at depth as all the microbes are processing those nutrients. If you look at water quality in those flood waters, it generally ranging during these events about 2 to 6 milligrams per liter, and we really saw very little, if any, nitrate in the groundwater, mainly because of most of the subsurface processing going on. So what are the potential for floodplain restoration? These are the ultimate wet spots on the landscape. For example, here's the English River watershed. We have a floodplain mapping program that's identified all the floodwater, all the floodplains in Iowa. Okay, so we have all the flood inundation maps generated for all of Iowa's floodplains. So there's nothing unique here about this site that we can't see at every other floodplain site in the state. You look at the percentage of the area of how much of that area is in a 2-year floodplain versus a 500-year floodplain. You see that 50% of the land in the 100-year floodplain is in crop. Okay, it represents only 27% of the watershed. In the 2-year floodplain, 28% of the land in the 2-year floodplain is in crop, and that's only 3% of the landscape. This is suggesting to me that we have opportunities to take some of that land out of the 2-year floodplain that we know floods every other year, so to speak, and get some water quality benefits of some floodplain restoration. Now this floodplain talk is an entire, I really flew through this. I'm running out of time, but there is a lot to digest here in this floodplain work. And I think this would be a golden opportunity for future work. So in conclusion, kind of combining all the sites, we can really follow the water from the upland location down to a floodplain and find a lot of locations where we can see some water quality treatment benefits. There are opportunities to capitalize on these landscape wet spots for nitrogen reductions. And I do feel we need to expand our collective thinking beyond traditional infield and edge of field practices and use the landscape to our advantage. Okay, so there are, you know, as you drive around and see locations in Scott County and elsewhere, there are locations where water naturally accumulates. Those are the natural wet spots that are providing some benefit, and I feel like we should use those a little more comprehensively to our advantage. That would be all my talk. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Okay, yeah, if you have questions, go ahead and start typing them in the chat and I'll share them with Keith. Nick says, would you expect oxbows to be more prevalent in the Des Moines lobe or the Iowan surface?
Probably off the lobe. The lobe is just such a young landscape. However, you know, as a natural system, probably more so on an older landscape than a young landscape. But the Des Moines lobe has been so impacted by channelization and ditching and so forth. You might see more scars evident in the Des Moines lobe than you do off the lobe. So it's kind of a, you know, a yes, but kind of answer.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions? Go ahead and type them in the chat if you do. We'll wait a couple minutes to see. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions, but oh, here we go. Steve says, any research on plant type preference for roadside ditches?
No, in fact, not yet. I'm hopeful that we can investigate a lot more that a lot more thoroughly. We did do that didn't make the cut here on this condensed version, but we did have a vegetation survey done of those ditches in Lime Creek watershed. And of course, as many areas of Iowa, it's just dominated by cool season exotics. Although there were a handful of sites that did have a lot of natural vegetation left in it. But the range of vegetation that we saw in those ditches at, you know, an N=6 population was not enough to tease out any differences. That being said, though, that's an area that needs more work, because I do believe that there would be some vegetation influence here that we missed with our small little sampling population. So that I'm hopeful that we can get some funding at some point to really expand some of this work to other ditches where we might see a range of vegetation and actually figure out the benefits of the different vegetation on that nutrient processing.
Okay, Nick says, what kind of work or practices should we be considering to restore these 2-year floodplains that are cropped?
Well, I think the #1 practice would be to, you know, get them out of the annual crop production. So that's the #1 practice. Again, there's another study that we looked at in the Lower Cedar, where we actually had help from the Nature Conservancy to look at the effects of floodplain farming. And it was really quite dramatic, the differences between farming in a floodplain versus a cool season grass, or reed canary grass, or the trees. There was very little difference between the the perennial vegetation of grass and trees, but there was a huge difference between the perennial vegetation and the annual crops. So I think the main practice at this point is to let those 2-year floodplains be natural again and put some sort of perennial vegetation on them.
Okay, Matt says, why do you think there is not more interest in ditch wetlands?
Well, I think the issue there is that we're bumping into what the ditches were first made for, you know, so which is to drain the excess water off the roads and kind of keep them the road-based drained so they don't get saturated and lose their strength. You know, so we're trying to work within this built environment and gain some additional benefit from them. So I'm encouraged by the Iowa DOT in their interest in some of this work to think about maybe redesigning some ditches to gain multiple benefits as opposed to just the singular engineering benefit that they were built for. So I think that could be some work down the road relating to this and better designs and maybe using some of the ditches as, you know, to societal benefit as opposed to just for the engineering benefit of the road.
Okay, Edward said, how can we get the LiDAR work done on our properties to identify potential oxbows?
Well, I think there's your local NRCS office or some of the NGOs that we work with that were part of this work, like the Nature Conservancy. Nick has weighed in here, Karen Wilkie. I think there are folks that have the expertise and could help. And so I think some of these other folks could probably help out with that. At the Geological Survey that I work with, we're probably not in that position. We could probably help maybe on a case-by-case basis. But I think the fact that these oxbows are now being recognized as an approved INRC practice gives some real motivation to get other people jumping in to identify where these are located.
Okay, Nick says, how do the restorations need to be restored?
Not sure I'm following that. Which restorations?
Elaborate, Nick, if you're still on.
Well, there's the guidance that we're working on with the Nature Conservancy and INRC and so forth. We'll be looking at some of the practices and the procedures needed to restore these things. So there's some general guidance out there in terms of the size of the tree canopy and the excavation depth and connections and so forth, beyond the scope of this talk that are out there. One of our main partners through this entire process has been the Fish and Wildlife Service out of the Davenport area. So I feel like I would reach out in that direction for specific guidance as well.
Okay, and our partners, Vice Chair Steve Gustafson weighed in on the LiDAR. He says there's online public data that a landowner can get a 2-foot contour for a property. So you can contact us at Partners of Scott County Watersheds and we can find that information to send to you. The email is info, I-N-F-O, at partnersofscottcountywatersheds.org. Okay,
Thanks,
we have a minute left if anyone has any other questions they want to ask. Oh, and then Karen also weighed in, LiDAR and 2-foot contours will only find oxbows that are not completely filled in, can look at historic aerial maps too.
Thanks, Karen.
All right, any other questions? Okay, well, it is 1 o'clock. I want to thank everyone again for attending this forum, and thank you, Keith, for being our guinea pigs for a virtual forum. So we hope to see everyone at our next forum in May. Hopefully it's in person. Stay tuned to the partners website and Facebook page to learn more about that. And then Keith, we'll share your contact information when we share the link to this presentation on our website too, in case anyone has questions for you.
Great, sounds good.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks a lot.